Over. And it's just taking one little second. Okay, and we are live. Hi, Mighty Blazers. I'm your on-air host, Sara DiVello, and I'm here with my next Mighty Mystery guest, Robin Wasserman, here to talk about her brand new book, Mother, Daughter, Widow, Wife. Robin, welcome. Tell us about your book.
Thank you so much. I can tell you've been doing a lot of this, and you can tell maybe this will be my first of these. This is my very first ever online book anything.
Oh, yay. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you if there's anybody out there watching. I don't know how to tell, so I'm just going to pretend that there is.
Yes, there is.
My book. So this is my book, Mother, Daughter, Widow, Wife. I can't figure out also how to position it so you can see the whole title. So you just have to imagine.
That's perfect.
It's a book about a woman who wakes up on a bus with no memory of where she's going or where she's come from or who she is. She's in a... my book. So
I'm sorry, that's the Facebook is just echoing for a second, but I fixed it.
Okay. She's diagnosed with being in a fugue state, which is a state of temporary amnesia that descends without any apparent physical cause or warning and lifts just this quickly. And the thing that I thought was exciting about a fugue state is that when you wake up from the fugue, you forget everything that has happened within the fugue. So for the duration that you're in this period of temporary amnesia, you are a person with no past and effectively no future. So it's almost as if you're a figment of your own imagination.
How bizarre.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So the book is about this woman, Wendy Doe, who wakes into this fugue state and has to build a whole new life from scratch. And it's also about the women sort of circling around her in her life. So a young postdoc grad student who's studying her brain, her daughter who wakes up one day to discover that her mother is gone, and the widow of a very famous memory scientist who himself has maybe forgotten the difference between studying a person and owning a person, in terms of claiming a stake of ownership over their body and their mind. So yeah, it's a book about memory and loss and adultery and the Philadelphia suburbs. And it's also sort of my attempt to figure out what it means to be a grown-up when you sort of don't have any of the trappings of traditional grown-up life.
Oh, I already love it, especially the Philadelphia part. I'm a Philly girl. My entire family is based there. I'm the lone wolf up here in Boston. So I miss it desperately. But Robin, I have to, before we go any further, share just a few of your absolutely rave reviews. So Time Magazine says, in Wasserman's timely examination of memory, womanhood, and power, Wendy's daughter sets out to find her mother, and their situation only grows more grave. Whoa. BuzzFeed Book Club says Wasserman's sophomore novel is a labyrinth story set about memory, truth, and power told in two timelines. I love two timelines. That's amazing. Booklist says Wasserman asks big questions about how well we can really know another person, the nature of truth as it relates to memory, and what all of this means for how we perceive ourselves. The novel ultimately has some great twists, and all those questions Wasserman raises make it an excellent book discussion choice. Oh my goodness, these are amazing. Publishers Weekly raves shrewd, beguiling. This examination of how one man in power can abuse the women closest to him delivers the goods. That's what we like. We like those goods delivered. Library Journal, oh my gosh, these are all amazing, says for readers of stylish psychological thrillers. Oh my goodness. Tom Perrotta says Mother, Daughter, Widow, Wife is suspenseful, keenly intelligent, and thoroughly engrossing. Wasserman's novel explores the complexities of memory and identity with unflinching clarity and deep compassion. I could go on and on. You have gotten so many amazing reviews. Congratulations. Tell us about your research process into neuroscience, into the fugue state. Tell us about this. Why this book? Why now? And how did you research it?
I think I got the first kernel of the idea for this book. So as I say, I've been sort of casting around for what kind of what kind of story I have the authority to tell about being a grown-up woman. Basically, I've written all of the other books I've written have been about teenagers, and so I knew this was going to be my first book about adults, and I wasn't sure what it was going to actually be about. And when I really started thinking about, okay, what do I know about being an adult and an adult woman specifically, I found myself initially at a bit of a loss, because I am a grown-up, but I don't really have any of sort of the trappings of what we think of as traditional grown-up womanhood, right? I don't have a spouse. I don't have a child. I don't have a house. Back when I started writing this book, I didn't have a job or a car. I now have both a job and a car, so it's very exciting. But I felt like I was sort of, I felt, because I didn't have any of those kind of traditional trappings, as if I was almost impersonating this role of being a grown-up and being a woman in some ways. And I just spent a lot of time thinking about, like, okay, what kinds of stories do we tell about women? What kind of roles do we allow women to play in narrative? And I was thinking through all of that, and I happened to be like on a subway platform and reading an article about a man who'd been in a fugue state for 30 years or something. It was a really fascinating story, but it was, I was really seized with the idea of the fugue state itself as a way of getting into a lot of the questions I've been asking about obligations and responsibilities and roles we're expected to play and what happens when we're untethered from them, right? So I realized the fugue state sort of offered this vehicle for a story that was about a woman who was not attached to any of those things and didn't carry any of those things. And as I kind of started adding characters and narrative to it, I decided to structure it around this whole collection of women who didn't have any of those things, right? This book is in many ways about a daughter who's lost her mother, and a wife who's lost her husband, and a woman who's lost her past, all of these women who are sort of untethered from the things that made them who they were. So that was sort of my way into fugues. And I'm sort of a failed historian of science, and I've spent a lot of time studying the history of psychiatry and the history of mental institutions and memory specifically. And so it felt like the perfect way of sort of fusing my emotional interests and my, I call them academic interests, I guess. So yeah, I did, once I sort of settled on this as the project, then I did like a massive deep dive into all of the stuff that I've tried to gracefully stuff in here. So so neuroscience and the modern day study of memory and sort of the historical study of memory. And also there's a big thread in here about hysteria and sort of 19th century, specifically like famous 19th century hysteria patients. And, I'm trying to sort of draw a thread, a fugue, because it doesn't have any diagnosable physical or biological cause, is in itself sort of a manifestation of the same kinds of things that hysteria was in the 19th century, a manifestation of. And actually there was like at the same time, there was a epidemic of hysteria in 19th century France, which was sort of the hotbed of hysteria. There was also an epidemic of fugue, which we talk about much less, but that was the other hot diagnosis, was women were labeled hysterics and put into institutions, and men were doing this thing where they would just wake up one day, forget their lives, and walk out into the abyss. And I thought it was really interesting the way that was gendered, and thinking about what it would mean to invert those genders and write about a woman who, instead of disappearing within, had kind of disappeared without. So I went down a lot of research rabbit holes, as you can imagine.
Oh my God, there's so much I want to get into there. But I do just want to take a brief moment to welcome our mighty mystery listeners. So my colleague and partner in crime, get it? Because this is a mystery. This is a mystery podcast. Jenna Blum is managing things over on Facebook. And so we're a team on this. And so people who are friends who are listening, tell us where you're from and what questions you have for Robin. The beauty of these mystery interviews is that you can have direct access to the author. You can ask Robin anything. She may not answer it, but you can ask her anything. So this is your chance to ask her anything about Fugue, about the book, about her process, about anything that you would like to. So please do introduce yourself in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, and any questions you have for Robin, I will get them right over to her. But while we're waiting for those to come through, I just wanted to dive into some of what you said. And there's so much, because I was a history minor, actually, a European history minor, because that's what it was interesting to me. And so I remember learning about this diagnosis of hysteria, and it was tied to the uterus, which they thought was like a little animal that lived inside women and ran around wildly, driving them crazy. And so when women acted anyway that was not in line with social norms, they were hysterical. And it was because of this animal, uterus terrorizing them. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting. I love what you said about men going without and women going within, which is so apropos for everything about men and women and our expectations and roles in life. So that is fascinating. I also love what you talk about being untethered from these expectations, these social and cultural expectations and norms about what is adulthood and what is womanhood. As a woman who is child-free by choice, I totally resonate with that. And there is so much pressure to, do the high school check, college check, marriage check, baby check, dog check, move the verbs check, second baby check, get back to work. I mean, it's like there's this checklist. And if you deviate from the checklist, people don't know where to slot you in. So I love that you're addressing this in your book and through your own personal experience, and through the state of Fugue, which I actually hadn't heard of. So this is all so fascinating. So what is one thing you want people to take from this book?
Oh man, I'd like them to enjoy it. That's probably, you mean like in terms of like a message?
Yeah. What do you want people to walk away from this book having felt or having experienced or having learned or think about?
I guess I think if it got them asking some questions about the way they construct the story of their life and how much about the past, how much of what they think of their own past as sort of set in stone might actually be up for the interpretation of what they choose to remember and choose to forget, and how that's shaping how they move into their future. Like, I guess I would be very excited if somebody came away from the book asking themselves questions on those lines that they hadn't thought to before.
Yay. Oh, wonderful. I love everything about that. We have a few comments from the audience. First of all, my very dear friend, Judy Ginsburg, is watching. Hi, Judy. She is a therapist, just retired from a 35-year career at Massachusetts General Hospital, the illustrious Massachusetts General Hospital. So welcome, Judy. I bet this is really, she says, this book sounds fascinating. I am definitely going to check it out. Yay. Thank you, Judy. I think you speak for all of us. Welcome. Sam says, hi, I'm Sam from Brooklyn. I read in the New York Times the musical structure of Fugue as underlying the structure of your novel. I'd love to know more about how you actually went about organizing and structuring the novel. Ooh, Sam, you're singing the song. Robin, tell us.
It's almost like I paid him to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah, Sam, you'll get that $5 on Venmo later.
I sort of had come up with an idea early on in the writing of this that I wanted to write a book about a psychological fugue that was structured as a musical fugue, which is one of those ideas that like sounds cool, and then you sit down and try to figure out what it actually means to do it, and it destroys the next several years of your life. But yeah, I didn't know I knew that there was such a thing as a musical fugue. I didn't really.
Wait, I don't know what that is. I will admit, I don't know what that is.
So a musical fugue, I'm still not very, I've read so much about it, I'm still not very good at explaining it, but it's basically like a category of composition that relies on multiple voices and counterpoint. And when I was reading about it, one of the things I was really interested, I was reading about fugues to start with just because I was curious if there was any connection between psychological and musical fugues. And as I started reading about the musical fugues, I was really engaged by the way they're described in kind of narrative terms, which is what made me think about structuring the book this way, because basically a fugue will start with one voice that is introducing what I think is called the subject, basically, and that will be some line of melody that you'll hear inverted and transformed in different ways over the course of the thing. After that, a second voice comes in, and it's playing the same subject, but in a different octave. In a four voice fugue, you'd have two voices in one key and two voices in another key, and they'd be separated by keys and octaves. And basically over the course of the composition, they play with the melody, they play with that subject, and they twist it around, and they invert it, and they, they play it backwards, they play it, and they play it in counterpoint. So against, instead of in harmony, counterpoint is when the melodies are kind of working against each other. This is apologies to anyone in this audience who is actually an expert in musical composition. I had my own expert in musical composition talk me through all of this, and I swear I understand this theory better than I'm articulating it. But what I really liked about it was the idea that the reason that psychological fugue and musical fugue have the same term is they both come from the same Latin root, which is fuga, which is either to sort of take flight or to chase. So the psychological fugue, I think it gets that name because one of the common tendencies when you're in a fugue is to try to put physical distance between yourself and where you came from. Fuguers tend to walk and just go places. And in the musical fugue, it gets that name because the melodies are chasing each other and sort of fleeing from each other. And it is this sort of sense of motion and cycle. And I loved the idea of telling a story that was in different voices that were all kind of iterations of the same voice, and that were separated by some distance. So in this book, there's four voices. Two of them are in first person and two of them are in third person. Two of them are in one time period, two of them are in the other time period. So it's just sort of my way of trying to embody that musical definition in the pages of the book. And all four women are in different ways reflections and echoes and inversions of each other and related to each other in various ways. Two of them are actually the same woman separated by 20 years. One of them is a mother of the other one. And I came to this because I thought it was a cool structure, but it did one of those things where it sort of became like the fundamental, essential heart of the book for me. Because I realized that the question I was trying to ask over and over again in the book, and it's one that I think the fugue asks of its listener, is how much can something be transformed before it becomes something else, right? It's sort of the ship of Theseus analogy. It's this: if you just keep making small changes, if you just keep turning this upside down or turning this backwards, how much continuity is there from beginning to end, right? And I think that's the question of the book. It's the question of the fugue, but it's also, I think, the question of the self, right? Like, how much can we change without being someone else entirely? And what does it even mean? Like, what is that thing that stays the same, right? What is that self, and how much continuity is there across transformation? So.
Whoa.
So thank you for asking, Sam from Brooklyn. Yeah.
Thank you for asking, Sam from Brooklyn. Lori says, what's the name of the book and author? Lori, welcome. This is Robin Wasserman, and we are talking about her book, Mother, Daughter, Widow, Wife, this beautiful red cover right here. So welcome. If you have any questions, everybody, we've got a good number of listeners. Just keep asking your questions. This is your time to pick the brain of this brilliant, beautiful woman. So please do just ask anything you want to. I know that I am learning so much. Oh, we're getting lots of hearts and likes from the audience. Thank you all so much. Also, Mighty Blaze co-founder Jenna Blum, New York Times bestselling author, her dad was actually a musical comp guy, and so she knows all about the fugue. She says it's such a cool idea for the book structure, especially about the psychology. Yeah, this sounds like an incredibly, to me, ambitious and overwhelming just to write this sucker.
Yeah.
I'm 6 years into mine, and I have 4 points of view, and I'm feeling overwhelmed and anxious. I'm sweating just hearing all that you took on. How long did it take you to write that?
It took me, I think it took me a couple of years for the first draft, and suffice to say, I I actually I've never done this before with a book, but I actually drafted each of the 4 voices separately. Like I wrote them as if they were sort of 4 little novels of their own, which, as you can imagine, meant that when I tried to weave them all together, it was like a giant, ridiculous mess. That I think that first draft, that also was the length of 4 short novels. So I think that first draft was like 800 or 900 pages long, which I really know because I decided I was going to print it all out and take it with me. I teach every 6 months at something called the Mountain View. Yeah. I teach at the Mountain View MFA program. We do a week-long residency every 6 months. So I was on my way to my residency, and I was driving up to New Hampshire with my friend Adam Wilson, who also has a book out today. It's called Sensation Machines. It's amazing. And we were late and there was traffic, and I was like, but I need, my whole vision for this revision is that I start it in New Hampshire. I need the printout, but there wasn't time. It was too many pages. So we had to keep stopping along the way, and I kept sending chunks of it to Staples. We passed through where my friend Kelly Link lives. And she printed out a big chunk of it for me, but we had to leave her house before it finished printing. So she had her husband mail me some to the hotel. It was insane. And then I got to this hotel, and the people who work at the hotel, I'm sure, also thought I was insane because I spread it, because that was my idea. I was going to spread the hard copy across the hotel room floor and then figure out how to integrate the page, figure out how to weave the stories together. I mean, and it was just I looked like I had lost my mind in this hotel room because it was 900 pages just spread out everywhere. And basically nobody should ever write a book that way. It was not efficient. And then I had to cut out 400 pages somehow and restructure it. And I restructured it over and over again. And the next time when I did a really major rewrite, then I tried to really write it in order so I could understand how the stories were speaking to each other. But even after that, I think I turned in my last major revision last Labor Day around, and I sort of at the last minute completely restructured it again, and in really weirdly substantive ways. There's a thing that you find out in this version, sort of in a 200 pages place different than you found out in the last version. It totally just changed the story, what order you told it in. So yeah, it was not the easiest thing to plunge myself into without thinking it through. Yeah.
No, that is an incredible artistic undertaking. Rena in our audience says, wow, that is long. Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Rena.
It's not that long now. It's very normal length now.
Robin, all I can do is when you were telling me that story of your friend Adam driving you to New Hampshire, I was picturing, I don't know why, him in a motorcycle and you in a sidecar, and him saying, I'm sorry, your novel doesn't fit in the sidecar.
I mean, I will say, A, it's funny you should say that, because I do have a different friend who is constantly threatening to buy a motorcycle and put me in the sidecar. But B, it was almost like that because we were driving with 2 other people, and everyone had their own suitcases, and there was a guitar stuffed in there. And no, I mean, it was the idea of stuffing my novel into that car was probably a metaphor for what was wrong with the novel. Yeah.
Your novel needed its own seat. They were arguing over who had to sit in the middle. Oh my gosh. Lori says, I'm reading A Little Life, and it's over 800 pages. I feel like I'll never finish it. We just want to clarify, Robin's book is no longer that long. She managed to cut it back. It's only now 747 pages.
324 pages, which is a very manageable length.
Very manageable length. That's a good weekend read. Sam says, I feel so differently. I couldn't put it down. I actually got to page 400 and got sad thinking it was going to end. I almost never feel that. I totally agree. I love long books.
Yeah. I mean, A Little Life was an extreme experience. Yeah.
A Little Life was not so little. No, this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the process alone, we have a lot of writers here on A Mighty Blaze and a lot of passionate readers. So I think we're all interested, both from hearing about it from a reading appreciation perspective and from a writing craft perspective. So I think this has been so helpful, to hear about that process and to hear that it was so long. So the title, I absolutely love it because it's so interesting. It sucks me in. So tell us about, how did you arrive at it? Did it arrive as a stroke of genius? Were you like, aha, or was this number 101? Tell us.
Oh yeah, this was number like 2001.
2000.
This was a hard one to title.
And tell us some titles that ended up on the cutting room floor that maybe you kind of miss.
Oh God. I think the original working title was Fugue State. The working title in my heart that only lasted about a month on the page was We Eat Your Hate Like Love, which is taken from a Bikini Kill song.
We Eat Your Hate Like Love?
Yes, that is still sort of the thematic title of my dreams. I think Lost Woman Song, that was another one taken from a poem. But I mean, I have hundreds of discarded ideas for this book. It was a really hard one. I honestly don't remember how I got the idea, but for the actual title, but it really seized me once I did. I love, I pronounce it in my head with the same inflection of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Yeah, me too.
For me, the title is sort of in conversation with that idea of what kinds of roles do we allow for men, what kinds of roles do we allow for women, how do we even frame that conversation? Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's also interesting that you said that this really came out of a time in history where they were diagnosing women a lot with hysteria and they were diagnosing men a lot with fugue. And wasn't that also the same time that Freud was starting to talk about, women and their pleasure and sort of being more internally focused, and men, and, and sort of, I think it's really interesting that there's this internal, external, sort of hidden versus very visible ideas about, how men and women are both, their expectations culturally and the social roles that they'll play, and how you're addressing that.
Yeah, well, and I think, so this is the peak of hysteria is actually right before Freud. Like Freud kind of destroys hysteria as a diagnosis with his theories, or transforms it. Before Freud, the sort of king of hysteria was this guy Charcot, who was a medical doctor and believed it, as was thought at the time, as a medical disease that was just sort of stimulated by problems with the mind and the uterus or whatever, but like had no, but that's what I thought was really interesting about it. Like Freud kind of shifts this whole study into a study of the mind. But for Charcot and the doctors that were working with hysterics at the late 19th century, they weren't interested in the mind. They didn't think that had anything to do with what was going on in these women's bodies. They were only interested in studying the symptoms. And so, they didn't consider it their job to sort of have conversations with these women and figure them out, because they didn't think that was relevant. And that I found sort of fascinating, and I think really spoke to the kinds of things I wanted to get at in the book, which is set in the modern day, but engages a lot with this history, that Charcot really believed that by understanding the physical symptoms much better than the women could ever hope to understand them themselves, he somehow had possession over their disease and by extension their bodies. Like he really behaved as if he owned these women kind of wholesale. And I was really interested in that idea of what it means to think, like how much knowledge extends to ownership, right? What it means to say, I know you better than you know yourself, and what it means to really divorce body from mind in that way, and really say like this, like your mind can be yours, but like your body, that belongs to me. And the way that Charcot's institution was set up, like that was just, in one hand, completely instantiated. These women were entirely at the I mean, I guess I say at the mercy of the male doctors, but it's more that they were kind of the playthings of the male doctors. The doctors would put them on display and, you know, do these experiments with them where they would just sort of, there's a big component of hypnosis in evoking hysterical symptoms. And they would basically like hypnotize these women and then get them to play act like, you know, like there was a funny one that was, I don't remember what funny in scare quotes. It was like some sort of menage a trois play acting thing where they would hypnotize these women into thinking one half of them basically wanted to grope this doctor and one half of them wanted to grope that doctor. And then they would sort of take pictures and laugh. Or there was a symptom where your skin would get very sensitive and you could just by tracing your finger along a hysteric's skin raise a red indentation that let you sort of write on their skin, basically. So these doctors would write messages on these women's skin and like sign their names on the women's bodies and that kind of thing. And I thought that was, you know, obviously horrifying and compelling and a narrative I wanted to plunge into, but also I thought it was really interesting the ways that these women in a different way had a lot more power in these spaces than they had in their own lives. And in a lot of ways, I think this hospital became sort of a safe refuge for women who were, you know, pushed into hysteria generally because terrible things had happened to them. And they entered this institution, which in many ways was terrible and oppressive, but in many ways made them celebrities. So the famous hysteric who's sort of at the center of the historical thread here is this woman who's known as Augustine. And she had a horrific life. She ended up in this institution where she became a celebrity. And in one sense, she was very beholden to Charcot. But in another sense, she was kind of ruling the roost. And I think there's been a lot of, scholarship sort of revisionist and then revisionist of the revisionists interrogating like how much of the whole syndrome of hysteria was about the doctors imposing symptoms onto the patients and how much was about the patients kind of, if not faking, then enacting symptoms because they wanted to perform for the doctors. And, you know, just sort of, I think the power dynamics are just much more interesting than they look from standing 30 yards back. And so I really wanted to play with that and just think through all the ways that, all the ways that in the present day, in spaces where we're studying women's bodies and women's minds, especially, we're still kind of grappling with those same questions and assumptions.
Oh, I love this conversation, Robin. And my friend Judy is saying, again, a retired therapist from Massachusetts General Hospital is saying the wandering uterus actually comes from Charcot. And I know Judy has studied with a ton of world-renowned leaders in the space, and also studied at Kripalu, integrating mind-body wellness. Judy's an incredible human being and one of my dearest friends. So yes, thank you. And I actually hadn't heard of Charcot before today, so I am just drinking in all of this fascinating information. So again, more questions from the audience, please keep them coming. I'm happy to filter them right over to Robin. Just let me know. I got my 2 screens going, so this is your time. And while we're waiting for those to come through, Robin, what's some of the worst writing advice you've gotten? And also conversely, what's some of the best writing advice that you've gotten and want to share?
Oh God. I mean, I think write what you know probably serves as both the best and worst advice I've gotten. If I had to choose one motto, I mean, and for not unsurprising reasons, I think it's very limiting advice. I think telling somebody write what you know just puts a cap on their imagination, I guess, especially if you're, as I was, a 3rd grader, 7th grader, 12th grader, hearing that in various writing classes. But also I think write what you know is in many ways sort of a challenge and an invitation, right? Because it really asks, like, what is the thing you know that no one else does? Like, what is the story that only you can tell? And I think for me that is both the hardest thing about writing, period, but also the most exciting thing about it. I think it was very hard for me to even believe that I had a story that only I could tell, much less that I could figure out what it was. And that's still sort of my daily artistic struggle, I guess. But also I think it's the reason to do it. And it's the reason I keep doing it. So yeah, thank you. And no, thank you for all of that advice to every writing teacher I've ever had.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you did that, right? Like yourself having not ever suffered a fugue state, knock on wood, but yet feeling untethered by the social norms that are put upon us, could write this story about a woman who's untethered from her life in a fugue state uniquely.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. Judy has a question. She said, what started your interest in the history of psychiatry? Ooh, good question, Judy.
Good question. I was a history of science major in college, largely because I was really into physics and astronomy, and the history of physics and astronomy, but not enough so to be a physicist. So I actually sort of stumbled into the history of psychology. I wrote my thesis on the history of psychology, and I honestly don't remember. I wrote my thesis on Timothy Leary's LSD, psilocybin and LSD experiments while he was a psychology professor at Harvard in the 60s, and on sort of LSD as a tool for the psychological and psychiatric community in the 60s. And I think I must have heard it as like a trivia fact at some point in college. I went to Harvard, and so I think I must have heard at some point about these experiments and got really into them. And that's how I sort of stumbled into writing a thesis about it, and the archives were there, so it just seemed a perfect fit. And because I was writing my thesis on that, I ended up doing a lot of research into just the history of psychology and psychiatry in general, especially in the 50s and 60s. And I took this amazing course while I was writing my thesis, which it's amazing because I actually attended it, where I think every other class I had that semester, I just cut class and like worked on my thesis because I was that kind of nerd. But this was a class called Madness and Medicine. It was taught by Anne Harrington, who is a historian of psychology. I think she just published a new book herself this year. And it just tracked the history of how we treated madness, starting from ancient times into the 20th century, and with a special focus, I think, on women's bodies and minds, largely because the history of madness really is also the history of how we treat women's bodies and minds. There are many points in history where madness just has a very female inflection to it in the way people talk about it and diagnose it, and especially, sort of in the medieval period where there's a big intersection between madness and witches, like that has such, it's so embedded with our conceptions of womanhood. So I've been sort of fascinated by it ever since. And I think a year or so before starting this book, I read this incredible book called Patient HM, which is about, it's a nonfiction book about the history of memory science and the most famous patient in the history of memory science, an amnesiac who's known as Patient HM. But it's also about institutionalized women in that mid 20th century period, and about lobotomies and the ways we've treated women. And I had already been like re-sparked on the subject of hysteria from working on my last novel, which sort of didn't end up being as much about hysteria as I had originally intended it to, but I had started reading and researching about it for that. And when I read Patient HM, it fanned the flame, I guess you would say it. So by the time I hit on the idea of the fugue state, I was like, oh, this is like everything has come together into the perfect storm of new novel.
Oh, I love that. All right, we have two more questions from the audience. Sam would like to know, are there one or two things that are helpful to keep in mind as we embark on your book? This idea of how we define ourselves and how we are defined, the notion of adulthood, other themes or questions we can keep our minds focused on. I sometimes like reading a book without anything to think about, letting the ideas come to myself, but sometimes I like themes or things to anchor me, especially when I'm so distracted with COVID and being trapped at home. Sam is all of us. I'm also distracted.
Fair.
Give us your insider reader's guide.
I mean, it's a great question. I'm not sure how to answer it because there are so many thousands of things stuffed in here. I mean, I think for me, I did spend a lot of time in the later drafts really thinking through the question of why people make choices they know are bad choices, and what happens, you know, whether the consequences of those choices should negate the reasons you made them in the first place, which is, I mean, is a very abstract way of saying this book is in large parts about like ill-advised adultery and marrying the wrong man and discovering that a lot of things you thought about your relationship that were true were not true. But I don't know, I was really interested, I think, in later drafts. You know, I sort of wrote, I think, a few very unnuanced drafts.
You're getting a lot of love and thumbs up for us, Robin.
Okay. I wrote a lot of really unnuanced drafts, I think, where I kind of knew where I wanted the characters to end up, but the choices they had to make to get themselves there, I think I found to be morally repugnant. And I didn't even realize that's what I was doing until I would give a draft to somebody and they would say like, wow, you really think all men are monsters, huh? And I would say, no, like, that's not it. And, you know,
you're like, I said morally repugnant. Yeah, I never said monster.
But, you know, and the woman at the heart of this, there's an adultery story at the heart of this. And you know, the first draft of it, I gave it to one of my most trusted readers. And she was sort of like, it's very clear that you, the writer, think that this woman is like committing some kind of horrible like trespass and deserves what she gets, which again had not in any way been my intention. And I didn't even, it took me a while to even believe that that was her read. You know, I had a very instinctive, like, that's not what's happening there. But I think it took me several drafts to, you know, I basically I had written a love story and forgotten the love part of it. Like I had written about sort of the consequences of making that kind of decision. And I had forgotten to actually write the narrative of falling into lust and obsession and love and desperate need and all of the joys that come with that, in addition to like the potential consequences. You know, that's the most obvious example, but really for all of the characters in here, I really needed to just find a way into just understanding, you know, like I say, not just bad choices, but how we judge, you know, how we judge those choices once we're in the stories that they built. You know, there's a moment toward the end of this book where somebody asks one of the main characters, you know, do you regret your marriage? You know, now that you see how now that you see how your life has ended up 20 years out, do you regret that choice? And the feeling I wanted to capture in that response is a feeling I have often had when I think about my own, you know, I've made a ton of choices that like did not work out that great. But
we all have.
But it's impossible. The biggest ones, right? The like, you know, like I live in LA now. I've been here for a couple of years. I also lived in LA like more than a decade ago, where I moved from New York to LA, hated almost every minute of being in LA, was miserable, moved back to New York so traumatized. I was like, I'm never leaving it again. Like it was a disastrous decision. But, you know, the question of whether you regret it, it's like regretting your whole life, right? Like I'd be a different person if I hadn't done that. And that was that's the kind of choice I'm really interested in. And that, you know, that was what I wanted to capture, both with that scene, but also with the whole book of you know, you are the story you're telling about yourself, right? But you're also trapped in the story made by your choices. Like as a writing teacher, we're always telling people character is made in choice. Like your reader is only going to come to know your characters by the choices they make, right? And that's like writing teacher advice, but this book is really trying to get at the question of how true that is for the self, right? Like how much we are constructing ourselves on a choice by choice basis. And if that's true, how impossible it is to look back and wish we had made some other choice, because that's a different person in a different universe that has an entirely different story, you know?
Oh my gosh. Wow. I feel like we're, I mean, addressing so much here in terms of the, cultivation of one's life and identity and the summation of choices. I mean, this is such a deep and meaningful conversation. So thank you for your authenticity and presence and wisdom and advice and openness and sharing. We have one more question. Does Robin feel like she has finally made it to adulthood? And how do you feel about the checklist now?
Oh man. Yeah, I gotta say, I was supposed to have my 20th college reunion this spring. It got canceled like the rest of life. Yeah, I would say by the time I finish this book, I definitely at least feel the age of adulthood. I do have a car now. I do have a house. I have a full-time job for the first time. You know, this is the first time I haven't been a freelancer in most of my adult life. And I guess unsurprisingly, the funny thing is, okay, it turns out none of those things actually make me feel more grown up, right? It turns out that the bullet pointed checklist is just like bullshit. Although I will say, buying a house, it didn't make me feel grown up. It definitely made me feel like, oh God, this is a thing for grown-ups. I don't know what I'm doing. This is crazy. That was definitely the most grown-up thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
But no, I think, I don't know. I think writing the book has, it let me work through a lot of the questions I had about that. Yeah. And it let me, it did, I think, let me vent some of the anxieties and insecurities that had been sort of, that had been swirling around for a long time. You know, I mean, like I say, all of my other books have been about teenagers, and I cannot count the number of times I've been at a cocktail party or spoken to a friend's parents or acquaintances or something, and they'll say like, oh, when are you going to write a book for grownups? Like, and the implication there always feels like, when are you going to grow up? And I always bristled against that. And I still do. But I think I must have internalized a lot of it, you know, and I think writing this book, I maybe like wrote my way through all of my anxieties and insecurities on that front too, because I do feel like now that I'm on the other side of it, now I'm in a sort of like, age is just a number, adulthood, who could say? There are no bullet pointed checklists, whatever. I mean, I've also moved, like I say, I moved from New York to LA, so I may just be a more free-willing person now. I may have transformed myself since I started this book, who could say? But yeah.
Now you're an easygoing California girl. I love it. Oh my gosh. Well, Robin Wasserman, I could talk to you all day. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us here on A Mighty Place. Thank you to all of our Mighty Mystery listeners. Thank you to my partner in crime, Jenna Blum. And we will see you all next week for Mighty Mysteries then. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.